Greenwald brought up an interesting point. He's connecting class with selling out. Now, this connects to Maxwell Frost. And I want to make a point here first before we get into this story. Selling out. Sometimes when you sell out, most of the time when you sell out, works out great for people financially, or it helps their celebrity status. But every now and then, there comes a person that will sell out and the exact opposite happens. And that person is Maxwell Frost. Because you see, Maxwell Frost decided to sell out his beliefs and support for the Palestinian-led movement in order to get a seat in Congress. And then only to get there and to not be able to afford to live there. Let's get into it. Let's do the damn thing, son. So Glenn Greenwald says, amazing, but not surprising. New progressive icon Maxwell Frost spent years as a pro-Palestinian activist. To run for Congress, he repudiated and reversed his views on Israel, cheered by Richie Torres and crypto money, enraging local activists. Now let's get into that, and I'm going to come back to the other thing that Glenn says here, because there's something I want to point out. How Florida progressive Maxwell Frost courted Palestinians, then abandoned them. Oh, we're calling it all out tonight. I'm holding nothing back. It's a new year and I don't care. We're getting into it. Now listen to this. I'm only going to read a snippet from this. Okay. And I think I'm going to make this bigger because, yes. Frost was embedded in local Palestinian activist circles and was even in a group chat with all the pro-Palestinian organizers in the Orlando area. He had signed the Palestinian Feminist Pledge, which calls for supporting the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, and sanctions BDS movement, ending military aid to Israel, and rejecting the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. He also signed a similar pledge from the Florida Palestine Network, FPN, a local grassroots group of pro-Palestinian advocates that was sent to Congress, that was sent to Congresswoman Val Demings. The lawmaker Frost is now set to replace come November. A copy of both pledges seen by MEE shows Frost's name among the signatories. So when FPN learned of his decision to run for Congress, they were all in support of him. Listen to this part. I had initially felt great about Maxwell as a candidate. There didn't seem to be any question about his views on Palestine. I was ready to fully support him. He was a grassroots organizer and was in the streets with us every single day. Now that is coming from Lamia, who was an organizer in Florida. Now, however, over the course of the next year, Frost began to receive more support on a national scale, as well as influx of pro-Israel endorsements and corporate money from a crypto PAC that was spending heavily against candidates critical of Israel. Several organizers who spoke to Middle East Eye shared their experiences of working for and supporting Frost because of his grassroots beginnings, only to have Frost later come out with a position paper that reneged on many of the promises he made to local activists. Dude had already started to renege on promises before he even got elected. Now, let's go back to this piece here, because I want to go into more of what Glenn says here about Maxwell Frost and this situation in general. The nexus of SBF and Sean McEllie and Richie Torres has been partially told, but only partially. Torres, the pure case of what AOC called a Trojan horse, is being groomed for higher office. Every identity box weaponized to advance his Israel fixation and status quo power. In case you forgot, listen to this.
Through. So what is your position just generally on that identity politics debate, and what role do you think it ought to have for voters in the 14th congressional district when deciding who they should vote for?
It's an excellent question, because sometimes people throw this term around, identity politics, and a lot of people, when they use that term, they'll all mean something different. And so in terms of using the term identity politics as vote for me, I am XYZ, to use that as the sole basis for voting for someone, I think is incorrect, and it's flawed, because, there are a lot of, I mean, there are a lot of Trojan horses. There are a lot of folks that say, vote for me, I am this intersection of different identities, but at the same time, they still try to advance or are primarily financed by special interests. So it doesn't necessarily get us to where we need to be.
And that is actually what Richie Torres did. That's exactly what he did. Vote for me. I'm this, and this, instead of focusing on policy per se. Now, Glenn Greenwald goes on to say, on the bickering over Frost's inability to rent a DC apartment, in Brazil, members are giving absurdly large state apartments in Brasilia or rent supplements. U.S. members have larger salaries, but it's vital we have non-rich elected officials who keep roots in their districts. Let's talk about this for a second. This is on purpose. You see, there's a reason why we don't have many people that are working class going to Congress. Most people who want to win have to quit their job in order to win. To run a successful, full-scale, launched campaign that has a chance of winning, you need to quit your job. Some of you may not want to hear this, but it's true. Most people who are working class and poor can't afford to do it. That was one of the things that Maxwell Frost complained about. He was like, I had to quit my job if I ever had a shot at winning. So he lost money, right? This is also why mainly people who are upper middle class and people who are wealthy are the ones who end up running for office. A lot of the PMCs, the professional managerial class, they're usually the ones that run. Why do you think a lot of the politicians in Congress are former lawyers? They have the money by that time in their career. They usually have the money saved up or put aside for them to be able to make a successful run. So keep that in mind. The system isn't broken. The system is designed to keep working class and poor people out. They don't want people like Maxwell Frost there. Just keeping it real with you. So let's talk about selling out, because Maxwell Frost did do that. He decided to sell out the Palestinian people so that he would not have large PAC money from AIPAC come up against him and prevent him from winning that race. So he sold out the Palestinian people to go to DC to do this job, to be a part of Congress. And then you get there and you can't even get a home where you're supposed to work. You can't get an apartment because of the credit situation. And there's no shame on bad credit. It happens. But what I'm saying is this: he sold out a whole population of people and a movement to get to a place in DC to be in Congress where he can't even afford to live. Think about it, people. Yeah, he won. Yeah, he's there, but the city don't even want to rent to him. His most recent statement was, I think I'll just have to couch surf. You guys believe in this shit? You sold out for this? And if you don't believe me, I'm not the only one who's brought this up. Because believe it or not, even Counterpoints brought it up. Listen to this.
Speaking of Israel, what point do you want to make today?
So in May of 2021, in the midst of the Gaza war, protests were held around the country. In Orlando, anti-war activists assembled downtown for a rally and a march and were joined by Maxwell Frost, an organizer who later went on to win the Democratic nomination for the area's congressional seat. It's a heavily blue seat, so he's heading to Congress. Here he is.
And like I said, the last thing I'm going to say again, and y'all can hear me say this over and over again, we have to demand, not ask, we have to demand that our leaders see the world through the eyes of the most vulnerable.
So that is Maxwell Frost right there. And this is a Palestinian-led action here. Okay? You see how people can just, this is why I told you guys, how you going to hold people accountable? You see how people can just flip just like that?
And use that vision to make every goddamn decision they ever make. Thank you.
Frost was an active member of the group that organized that march, Florida Palestine Network. And once he started his run for Congress, according to multiple sources I spoke to for a story just published in The Intercept, AIPAC and an allied organization, Democratic Majority for Israel, took extreme interest in his pro-Palestinian activism.
Took extreme interest in his pro-Palestinian activism. So he was already going to be a target. They were already targeting him. And instead of doing the right thing and upholding his standards here, he sold out. Listen to it.
In January, DMFI endorsed his opponent, Randolph Bracey, who expected to get big money spent on the outside to support him. But that money never came. Over the ensuing months, Frost, according to sources on his campaign, worked hard to moderate his position on Israel-Palestine in order to keep that big money and the big money pro-Israel groups from spending him into the ground. He also landed his own super PAC support from crypto billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried, whose super PAC Protect Our Future spent $1 million on his behalf. By the end of the campaign, Frost had significantly evolved his position. He had begun as a supporter of BDS, which stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and is a movement that tries to pressure Israel to end its settlement activity and its occupation of Palestinian territory. He ended by severely criticizing BDS as, quote, extremely problematic.
He ended with criticizing BDS as extremely problematic. How you go from being an organizer with the Palestinian movement to then criticizing the movement when you knew damn well what was going on. You were already a part of the organization. You knew the history. You knew the cultural history. You knew what was happening to the Palestinian people. How could you turn your back on them like that? Because it's one thing if you don't know and you're just listening to what mainstream media is saying. He knew.
Quote, I believe that the boycott, sanctions, and divestment movement is extremely problematic and undermines the chances of peace and a two-state solution. Additionally, it hurts both Palestinians and Israelis who suffer economically from it. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine have been designated by the United States as terrorist organizations, and all these groups are a part of the Central BDS Movement's Council, he said, which in my eye delegitimizes the entire organization and movement, unquote.
And just like that, Maxwell Frost caved. Turned his back on a whole entire population of people just so he could get a win, so he could get into DC. And then he got there, and now you can't even stay. Like, now you got there, you have no place to live. Was it worth it? In the end, was it really worth it? Now, Glenn goes on to say, in 2010, the GOP, led by Karl Rove, attacked a Tea Party insurgent for difficulty paying her college debt and other consumer debt. I wrote then about how gross that was, since that's most Americans' experience not being born a Bush. He goes on to say, it is not easy for Congress members both to keep a home in one's district and a place in DC. We just usually don't hear about it because Congress is filled with rich people who get richer in office. Frost's struggle is common in the U.S. Paul Ryan boasted of sleeping in his office. So I think the point that Glenn is trying to point out here, and I think what we need to focus on is the class struggle here, is the sense that, again, there are certain systems in this country that are designed to keep working class people and poor people out. And it seems like the only way that they get an opportunity with those positions is if they're the help. You know, it's like, yeah, I worked at the White House. I was a maid. Yeah, I worked at the White House. I was a janitor. Yes, I worked at the White House. I was a butler. I was the caterer. I was the groundskeeper. You see where I'm going with this? It's like you're only allowed to be in certain positions when you come from that type of class. But once you try to get into these PMC, these elevated positions, then you are seen as suspect. You're given a side eye, and you may not even be able to afford to live there. But what I want you to understand is that it's all on purpose. So if you can see here, I want to show you what Glenn is pointing out here when he talks about Paul Ryan boasted sleeping in his office. You'll see this here. If you look even in the Senate, I'm one of the very few people in there who doesn't have a net worth over $1 million. That came from former Senator Russ Feingold. Isn't this crazy? These people are rich. This is what I've been trying to tell people. People are like, they're not rich. They're just elected officials. Bullshit. Look up their net worth. A lot of those senators got bank, you guys. So that's an example that Glenn is pointing to there. And he goes on to say, as poor as Russ Feingold is relative to colleagues in the Senate, as poor as Russ Feingold is relative to his colleagues in the Senate, he's still a Harvard Law School graduate who owns his own home and has earned in excess of $100,000 as a U.S. Senator for the last 18 years. So even though Russ was poorer than his other Senate comrades, he was still a Harvard Law graduate, and he was still making six figures. You see what everybody following me here? So I think that this is something that is really important that we really need to focus on. We need to pay more attention to. Because at the end of the day, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And so some people didn't like what I said when we had the panel on New Year's Eve. And I said they wanted this idea of dump the incumbents. And they said, let's get all these independent candidates and get 400 of the people in Congress out in 2 years. And I said, number one, that's not going to be realistic. I'm all for third parties and independent candidates. I would not be voting Democrat or Republican. But with a 2-year time frame, the main thing that you have to focus on is getting corporate money out of politics. The response that I got was, well, you put those people in and that's how you get the corporate money out. We need to talk about the corporate money that happens during these campaigns. You need to talk about these PACs like AIPAC that come in and they put all this money up against these candidates, especially the ones that are running in support of Palestinians, and prevent those candidates from even getting their name out there and even winning in the first damn place. It was hard enough for someone like Nina Turner, and though she made mistakes of her own with her campaign, money came in at her. So we have to talk about the class issue. We have to talk about the class issue. It keeps a lot of people back. And in that sense, one of the things that we talk about a lot at RBN is that class is race and race is class.